So good morning, everyone. I hope that you are all doing well since our last meeting on Tuesday. So today we are here after the first presentation on the fundamentals of statistics and the data validations. We will look today at more in details at the different commodity statistics. So we will look at the different concepts for fossil fuels such as oil, coal, natural gas, but also we will look at renewables and electricity statistics. And today I am with Taylor Morrison, who as you met her on Tuesday, she works on African energy statistics, and she will help me with answering the questions that you may have. So this is the agenda for the training. Today we are doing the second webinar on statistics by commodity, and we will work together for the next 2 hours. Before we start with the technical part, let's quickly look at some of the housekeeping rules to make our sessions the most effective. So everything is done in Zoom, and we are recording the session, and we will be putting it on YouTube later, so that if you miss a part because of internet connection, or you want to share the webinar with other colleagues, you can do that. We recommend that microphones are turned off so that we don't have any background noises. And if you have any questions for us, you can use the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand as well, and we will give the floor to you. If you have any more questions, even after the training, you can send us by email to me, to Darlene on modeling, and also to the Africa program email. So let's quickly look at energy sources in different regions. If we look at OECD regions, we see that 80% of the energy supply mix is made of fossil fuel. But if we move to Africa, we see that it's only 50%, and biofuels and waste account for a much bigger share of nearly 50%, given that hydro, nuclear, solar, etc., it's minimal in Africa. But when we move further into sub-Saharan Africa, we see that the share of biofuels increased even more and is around 70%. And when we look at Kenya, it's a bit less than 70%. It's around 64% in 2019. And so in Kenya, we see that still solid biofuels still account for a big share of the energy mix. And when we look more at the specificity of Kenya, it's one of the only countries in Africa with geothermal. So now let's look quickly at how data are collected and when and where they come from. So what are the sources of data for supply and transformation? So for this, we usually collect data from energy industries, producers, importers and exporters, and also through surveys and administrative data. For demand data, for energy consumers, we usually have end-use surveys for households and enterprises. And for an integrated approach, we use existing surveys, direct measurement, estimation, and modeling in order to capture all the available data. Before we go into the presentation, let's again do some Menti questions to test a bit your knowledge on energy fuels. So please, can you connect to www.menti.com? I will do the same now. One second. Okay. So can you please connect to www.menti.com and use the code that appears up on the screen, which is 13, 79, 73, and 13. I will also put it in the chat box now so that everyone can see it. So please connect to www.menti.com and use the code 13, 79, 73, and 13. So in the meantime, I saw a question in the Q&A box. Let me just check if it's already online. It's not yet online. Marina is working on it to put it, probably today she will put it. So the first question is how imports of combustible fuels are taken into account in energy statistics. So is it every time that a product enters a country, even if it's just in transit? Do you consider this as imports? Will you take into account only by country of final destination, or will you take into account imports based on future contracts of energy commodities? So while you're creating your energy statistics, what type of imports will you report? So for the moment, we have 6 participants that have replied, and all of you said you should only account by country of final destination. Okay, so I see Taylor has replied that the recording for Tuesday is already on YouTube. So that's excellent. And she already shared the presentation, the link, I'm sorry. So yes, let's look at the right answer. And the right answer is indeed for imports of combustible fuels, you should report only the amount by country of final destination. And for combustible fuels, you don't report the amount that transit. And during the presentation, we will look at how to report imports and exports, a trade by fuel, and it's quite specific for electricity, for example. Let's look at the next question. What can we consider as refinery inputs? So refinery inputs, it's what you put in a refinery to transform into oil products. So do you input only crude oil, or second choice, crude oil and natural gas liquids, or can you input crude oil, natural gas liquids, and also other products of fossil and bio origins? So think of a refinery and the different fuels that you can input to be processed into other oil products, into secondary products. So for those who have just joined, please connect to www.menti.com and use the code that appears on the screen, so 13, 79, 73, and 13, so that you can participate in the Menti questions. Yes, so the code is, I just put it in the chat box. So we have 8 participants that have replied. One said that we can only input crude oil, and 8 that said you can put crude oil, natural gas liquids, and also other products of fossil and bio origins. So let's look at the right answer. So the right answer is indeed, you got it right. I'm sorry. So for refinery inputs, you can put crude oil, natural gas liquids, but also other products of fossil and bio origins. So not only crude oil and natural gas. Next question, what are natural gas liquids? So is it the same as liquefied natural gas? So LNG, so is NGLs the same as natural gas in a different form? Are natural gas liquids a waste product extracted during natural gas purification and of no value? Or is it a mix of gases different from natural gas and more similar to oil products? Or is it something completely different? So sometimes there are some confusions between NGLs and LNG. So we have 8 participants that have replied. Most of you are replying, it's a mix of gases. Give you some time to think about it. So very good. Most of you got it right. So natural gas liquids, it's a mix of gases and it's different from natural gas and more similar to oil products. And at the IEA, natural gas liquids, NGLs, are reported together with oil. And even in the oil questionnaire, we report natural gas liquids, whereas LNG, it's just natural gas in a liquefied form. So this is reported together with natural gas. So I think, okay, we'll keep this question for later. And when we will look at renewables, the next questions for later. And now let's move to the presentation.
This presentation will be in 5 parts for each of the main classification of our energy commodities. And for each of those parts, we will see first the key trends, then the key concepts, and finally some key points for data reporting. And this will be done for primary and secondary oil products, natural gas, coal and coal products. Also for this part, we will go quickly since coal is not energy commodity used a lot on the African continent. And then we discuss renewables and electricity. So let's start by discussing some primary and secondary oil products energy statistics. So first of all, let's have a look at the crude oil production by countries. And this production is dominated by 10 major producers who represent more than 70% of the global demand. And among those 10, we have 3 key actors that represent a third of this demand. So an energy landscape in that situation that is far from equally reparted around the globe. Here we are talking about crude oil, but this is not the only part of these categories. We also discuss about refined oil products, secondary oil products. So if we have a look now at the world refinery intakes, we can see that although OECD demand, OECD refinery intakes, stayed more or less stable in times, we have a an important growth of refinery activities in several non-OECD regions, such as China, Asia, Middle East. This growth shows a growth in the oil demand in those countries, of the need for the population of specific oil products. And as we can see on the right, China and all of the other non-OECD regions grew in terms of oil demand in those countries. It is not that visible on this graph on the right, but Africa also knew in the last decade an important growth in its oil demand. So let's have a closer look. In these graphs, you can see pretty clearly that transport has been the sector that drove the most oil demand in Africa for the last 30 years. Road transportations has grew a lot in those last decades, and hence the demand for oil products. But it's not only that. We have also a growth in aviation fuel due to increased air traffic, and also some marine fuel demand that grew due to the increased activity in several ports and port terminals in Africa. Do not forget that transport might be the biggest one, but we have all of those sectors that grew also in terms of demand, such as industries in a lesser way, residential, and non-energy use, which is still in a minor in Africa, while it represented a high share of demand now in OECD countries. So now that we discussed some key trends, let's have a look at how we classify our products, those products in our methodology. So we try to distinguish between the products that feed the refinery and the product that comes out of the refinery. So primary oil products, which are coming from natural resources, and finished secondary oil products, which are manufactured in the refinery. This is a rough definitions, of course, because we have some of the output of the refinery that will be used later on as input of refinery. So this will get a little bit more complex later on. Just remember that those products can be classified in many ways. Also for the finished secondary oil products, due to the fact that they are sold products, the name most of the time comes with a specific set of physical properties. Please, if you have doubts on how to report a specific product, do not hesitate to refer to the IRES, so the International Recommendation for Energy Statistics from the United Nations. This is the methodology that we are following at the IEA, and that is followed by most of the international organizations. So to discuss it a bit more in detail, in primary oil products, you will find crude oil and natural gas liquids, for example, coming from oil wells or natural gas fields. But you can also find some synthetic crude oil, which we'll discuss a little bit later, and some secondary products as inputs to the refinery, additives and feedstocks, for example. On the other end of the refinery, we will see first of all, some gases, some refinery gases that are part of the process, and then all of the products that we can find on the market today, such as naphtha, gasoline, diesel, fuel oil, lubricants, bitumen. And in our statistics, we try to focus on the the quantity of those products that will be used for energy uses, of course. So now let's have a look at how we could represent the chain of flows for each product. So let's first, the primary oil products. The refinery intake is mostly crude oil, but as I told you before, it can also include some other primary and unfinished secondary oil products. But let's keep it simple for now. We focus on the indigenous production of crude oil and some other sources for natural gas liquids, for examples. One note here, we focus in our methodologies on marketable productions, onshore or offshore, but marketable production coming from within the border of a country. If it's coming from another country, it will be reported as trade, so imports or exports. Then we can have also some stocks, some crude oil that have been kept in waiting for the demand for its demand to be used in the refinery. And then we have other flows of consumptions and supply, such as the direct use of primary products. Crude oil can be sometimes used, for example, to generate electricity. And we have some byproducts and finished products that are transferred to be used as input to the refinery. Just a note on the byproducts here, it represents the feedbacks from the petrochemical industries. We will not detail more here, but this is a part of the oil statistics that can be kind of complicated if we look in a more closer way. So now on the other end of the refinery, we have our refinery that will provide the gross inland deliveries of secondary oil products. But to sustain its activity, most of the time, the refinery burns some of its own production. So refinery fuels will be consumed within the refinery to sustain its own activity. Then we have the refinery gross output, so the outputs of, let's say, motor gasoline or diesel from the refinery, which will be part of the gross inland delivery, and the primary product receipts. So, for example, as I said before, the crude oil that will be used to be burned in a power plant to generate electricity. We can have then some products, so products transferred to be used as primary oil products in the previous slide, and inter-product transfers. Those transfers will be, for example, some specific refined oil products that will be used as another product with other properties. Then, of course, we can have some trades of those products, so import and export from outside of the countries, and international bunkers. So here we report all of the fuel consumptions for airplanes or maritime ways that concerns trips that originated or are going outside of the countries, that are not staying from within the country. And again, we can have here also some stocks of those products for safety reasons, for commercial reasons, for many possible reasons. The gross inland deliveries will be provided for energy sector use, for transformations, and for final and non-energy consumptions. Now, let's have a look at a complete oil data sets to highlight some important trades for Sub-Saharan Africa. So, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in general, we can find countries that produce a lot of primary oil products, so crude oil, NGL, etc. So, the production that is there. But since the capacities, the activities of refinery is very low in Sub-Saharan Africa, we have very few importations of those primary oil, and a vast majority that is exported toward other countries that will who will do the activity of refined those primary products. So this high level of export I told you shows the lack of capacities in refining. And then if we have a look at the oil products, we can see that the countries are mostly dependent on the importations of the secondary oil products to provide the demand of the population for mostly transportation here. As I told you, the refining capacity do not cover the regional demands. Hence, the reliance on imports that we can immediately see with our statistics. So, if we have a look on how we can try to check our data and make sure our data makes sense, one of the main things that we are paying attention to is the transformation efficiencies. The transformation efficiencies. When you take any transformations, here we'll be focusing on refinery, we check the outputs and the intakes of the refinery. Those are the two main elements that we have in terms of data. So we take these intakes and these outputs, and we try to see if the losses that occurred during the transformations made sense or not, if the value of the losses that we see. Attention here, we speak about refinery losses when the intake is superior to the output, and refinery gains when the intake is inferior to the output. And we calculate the yield of this refinery by doing some simple calculation. We divide the output of total secondary products by the intake of total primary products, and we put it in as a percentage. So we say that there are losses in the refinery if the yield is below 100%, and gains if it's above 100%. Of course, here, if you do this calculation, you need to have everything at the same units, and units matters in this case. Because in mass units, you would expect some small losses and no gains at all. You do not create mass during such transformations. In energy units, it's the same. Due to evaporations, you would lose in total a little bit of the carbon content, so of the energy contained in those products. But in volumes units, if you calculate, for example, in liters or cubic meters, you would expect some slight gains because the products, the secondary oil products that you are creating in your refinery are lighter and occupy more volumes at the end of the refinery process. Now, if we discuss about the final consumption of those oil products, as I told you, those products have specific properties, specific physical and chemical properties, and for this reason, we expect them to have a specific use, a specific final consumption sectors in which we expect them to be. Of course, there can be exceptions in some countries, in some cases, but those, in that case, needs to be documented and explained in your statistics. So here are some examples. Crude oil, as I told you, can be used in electricity plants, but we have also fuel oil and diesel that are most of the time used for this. In aviation, you would expect jet kerosene or aviation gasoline. Transportation, of course, we would expect gasoline, diesel, LPG, and etc. You can see here some main uses, maybe one point on non-energy uses. This part we still record it for accountability, and bitumen is mostly used, for example, in the creations of roads. This is the last part. This is the end for our discussion on oil products. Now let's talk about natural gas, and let's start with some key trends on these products. So, natural gas is the fossil fuels that grew the most in the last decades. Its largest producers are now USA and Russia. And its demand almost tripled since 1973, and it's mostly due for its large demand in heat and power productions. Its trade is both in gaseous form through pipelines and in LNG forms, so liquefied forms through tankers, which explain partially its big increase in demand in the latest years because of its ease now to transport this commodity around the world. But it's not the only reason. The main reason is that natural gas is the fossil fuels that emit the less CO2 per unit burned. It's around 60% of coal, for example, which explains its interest for many countries to use this fossil fuel to reduce their carbon footprint while doing their green energy transitions. And as I told you, the dominance of pipeline trade has been decreasing since the emergence of liquefying technologies, which help bring this fossil fuel into other countries. Now, let's have a look at Africa situations. So, global demand for gas doubled since 1990, but in the case of Africa, it almost quadrupled in the same period. It still represents only 4% of the global demand, but still the growth is very impressive when we see it. This growth, as for any countries, is mostly grew by electricity demand. We'll see it right now. So this is the chart that presents the demand driving sectors for natural gas in various regions. So OECD, non-OECD, we can see that in any case, power and heat generations are on top of the driving sectors, but there are already a distinction between OECD and non-OECD regarding the demand in residential sectors, as many office and buildings in OECD are now hit by natural gas when it's less common in non-OECD countries. If we have a look at Africa and more specifically Sub-Saharan Africa, we can see that this trend is becoming more and more visible, with Africa as the global consuming 60% of its natural gas for power and heat generation, and even more for Sub-Saharan Africa. So our methodology to collect the data with the IEA in our methodology tries to cover all stages of its supply side. So firstly, we focus on the production of natural gas. Again, we talked about this in a few slides, but we focus on the domestic and marketable production here and received from other sources. This can be gases from an oil field or some gases coming from a coal mine, for example. Natural gas is mainly produced by extracting a mixture of methane from the underground deposits, and also a small share of gas blended into the natural gas grid that come from oil, coal, or renewables. We also cover in our methodology the infrastructure that connect productions with consumptions. So this includes the transmission pipeline systems, the distribution systems, and some LNG, the LNG terminals in the country. Finally, at the end of the chain, natural gas is consumed in different sectors, such as the heat and electricity generation in power plants, or water and space heating for production in the residential and commercial sectors. Another very important part of the supply chain is the trade. Natural gas can be imported and exported through pipeline and liquefied, or liquefied. Now, the arrow that appears represents the interaction of the flow with the infrastructures. All the natural gas produced or imported by pipelines are mixed in the transmission systems, and the imports of LNG are regasified and then mixed. Some big power plants may be located right next to an LNG terminal and sourced directly from the regasification process. From the transmission system, it goes to the distribution network, which has a lower pressure. Most of the small and medium natural gas consumers are connected to this grid, which explains the importance for us to have a clear and precise data collections on the trade of natural gas, to know which part has been imported as LNG or as gas through pipelines. Now, let's discuss again on the production of natural gas. As a reminder, in our methodology, we measure the productions once the products are in marketable state. This is once we have subtracted all the impurities and subtracted the quantities of natural gas flared or re-injected. Re-injected quantities often occur in an oil field with associated natural gas. They are re-injected to favorize more commercializable products and to keep the pressure within the field. Also, keeping track of re-injected quantities is not mandatory. We encourage countries to keep track of those values and especially of the flared gas, which are important for the CO2 accountability of a country. They represent a large part of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. So we have here an extraction point. It can be an oil field, a gas field, a coal mine, and from it we have the gross productions. This gross productions, part of it will be flared, as I told you, or re-injected, and then the rest goes through the natural gas processing, in which we extract the impurities, so sulfur and other elements, and also natural gas liquids, NGLs, that will be found later in our oil statistics. Please refer to the previous part. And out of this processing, we will have the marketed productions of associated gas, non-associated gas, petroleum gas, and this is the reported quantity on which we focus later on in our statistics. Again, in any statistics work, the units and physical, and especially here the physical conditions in which the measure is made are important. Natural gas being a gas, the pressure and temperature at which you are doing the measure of volumes will impact the result of your measure, and it's important that those points are made in a clear in your data sets. As I told you before, regarding natural gas reporting, most of the difficulties comes actually from the trade data. Import should cover gas entering your countries for domestic consumption and reported under the country where the gas was produced. So import, for example, from Nigeria would be classified in such way. Export should be domestically produced, so only the quantity leaving the country should be reported under exports. To say it in another way, we focus on the ultimate origin or destinations of the gas, and we do not include in our data statistics the transit and re-export of natural gas. Now, if we talk a little bit about transformations, natural gas can be used in several ways to be transformed into another energy form. So the most obvious is the electricity and or heat plants, so to produce electricity and heat. But it can also be used in some coal processes mixed with other elements in coke ovens, blast furnaces, or gas works plants to generate several gases that will be burned to sustain the activities of those industrial activities. And finally, it can be used in a gas to liquid plants to generate some synthetic oil products. We will not go too much in depth here, but keep in mind that this exists and could be reported in some of the data you encounter. So now we are done with natural gas and we will move on toward coal statistics. Now we will talk briefly about coal and coal products. Regarding coals, the key trends are, of course, located in Asia with China and India. China is the world's largest producer of coal, followed closely by India. And those two countries use a large part of coal because of its abundance, cheap cost, and low technology barriers that allow a quick generation of electricity and support for industrial activities, such as iron and steel productions and cement manufacturers, for example. Coal has some environmental concern linked to those activities because it is the largest CO2 emissions per unit of energy burnt among conventional fuel. But it's not that of fuel from the past because it has some development possibilities such as carbon captures and storage, and could still have some years in the futures of being consumed. Now, if we have a look at the classification in our methodology, there are several ways, because of historical and scientific reasons, of classifying coal. In our methodology, we try to do it by quality of the coal. So you would have here hard coal or brown coal, describing their physical aspect. And from that, we would have distinction between coking coal, anthracite, over-bituminous coal and sub-bituminous coal, and lignite. The distinction being made with their calorific value, the amount of energy that they contained, and the amount of carbon within their physical constituents. Another way to distinguish is to see through their usage. For example, coking coal is sometimes referred as metallurgical coal because it's used mostly in iron and steel industries, and anthracite and bituminous coal will be used mostly in electricity and heat generations or residential smaller activities, and will be referred as steam coal because of its use in generators. Lignite, it's still usually excluded from this kind of classifications. One important element here to keep in mind when you talk about the coal statistics are that calorific value may vary depending on the flows you are checking in your statistics. For example, the calorific value in your productions might not be the same as the one used in your consumption in electricity and heat generations because of selection of specific coal quality for specific consumption and the mix with the trade of those products. So if we check now those five types of coal that we discussed in the previous slide are what we call also primary coal. So fossil fuel extracted from a mine and made of carbonized vegetal matters under the form of a rock. But it is not the only the only product that we cover in coal. We have also derived fuel, such as we had secondary oil products, we can have some derived solid products from activities such as coal tar, coke coke, or patent fuels, and also some manufactured gases that are the outputs, some of the outputs of activities in metallurgical, in the metallurgical sectors, for example. As I told you before, the weighted average for calorific values are important to be made when you are working on coal because of the real variation you can encounter depending on the source of the coal you are checking right now. So here is a little example of a calculation in a country that use a mix of calorific value of coal coming from 3 other countries. And if we do the calculation of the weighted average, so as a reminder, you multiply the calorific value by the quantity, the respective quantity consumed, and you sum those elements and divide them by the total quantity consumed, you obtain the average net calorific value that you will be used for your total coal consumptions reported in your energy statistics. This can apply, of course, to any other energy commodities that you will be using in your datasets. One last part on calorific value. As I told you, we expect it to vary depending on the flows of consumptions. But of course, it is not the only way. It is not. We do not expect it to vary in a crazy, very large way. We expect for each product the calorific value to be within specific range of value. So, for example, cooking coal, we expected between 25,000 and 33,000 kilojoules per kilograms. And also, depending on which products, we would expect the variation between the NCV and the GCV to be around 5 or 10%. So this slide is available right now, so please don't hesitate to refer to it if you have doubts on the value you obtained for specific product that you would encounter. The crowd balance, when we present it, is actually the easiest to represent in terms of difference between the supply and the demand. So supply, we have the domestic production from various sources, trade and stocks variations, and all those elements represent the supply of coal. And on the demand, you will have the transformations, we see that just after, the energy industry on use, and the total final consumptions. Do not forget that due to the way coal is transported, most of the time by trucks, there can be losses that are important. So do not forget to keep track of those distribution losses to keep your statistics in a good way. Coal balance, so we talk, as I told you, we talk now about, and finally about transformations. It's actually the same almost setup as for natural gas. So you would have coal to consumed in electricity and heat plants to generate those two energy commodities. And then you would have the consumption of coal within various industries such as coke ovens to create coke oven coke. Those products being used in blast furnace for metallurgical activities. And finally, you can have some coal used in gas works to generate gas workers and gas coke. One last part, again, this is in Africa only used in South Africa, but good to remember about it. You can use coke oven coke in liquefaction plants to generate some synthetic oil products. So not used in many countries, but still good to keep that in mind. If you see the term of synthetic crude oil, it can be coming from coal products. This is all that we will cover in coal for Africa. And now we turn.
I think we'll make a pause now and take some questions on coal, oil, and natural gas. Thank you very much to those who have been sending us questions in the chat and Q&A box. And so from Lee Okombe, we had a question that Taylor already replied on stock build and stock draw. So when you're building stock, it means that you are taking out from what could have gone to the domestic market and you're saving it. So it means that you should report it as a negative number in your commodity statistics. And when you're drawing from your stock, you're taking out from your stock to consume, then you're adding more fuel to the market. And so it should be reported as a positive number. So I hope that this is clear in your mind. There are two other questions, one on a comment from Lee, considering that the African oil demand has primarily been attributed to road transportation, has the IEA or other agencies undertaken any analysis on the impact of e-mobility adoption on oil demand? So yes, at the IEA, we have been making analysis on the impact of electric vehicles on oil demand, and there are a few reports and analysis that we have published. For example, there's the Global Electric Vehicle Outlook that came out last year, so I will share the link to the report in a few seconds. And there are other commentaries and analyses that the World Energy Outlook has been doing, and you can check in the different reports. It's true that we, in Africa, e-mobility is not yet big, so most of our analysis it's on global or more on European countries, China, US, but I think you can find some analysis, some broad analysis on Africa. There's another question. One of the presentations on natural gas outlook indicates that in Africa, natural gas is not consumed in the residential sector. This is contrary to reports indicating substantial household natural gas usage in Tanzania. So for this one, I'll let Taylor reply because she has been working on Tanzania and can tell you more about it.
Thanks, Akia. So we currently don't have any statistics for residential natural gas consumption in Tanzania, only LPG. So we have not yet started or finalized the 2020 data. So that's one thing that I will look into when putting together the 2020 balances. But as far as our statistics sources go, we don't have any data on that, unfortunately.
Yeah, so please, Lee, if you have a report that you can share with us regarding this, and we can also check with our contact in Tanzania if they can also send us data on natural gas usage in the household. Many countries have difficulties collecting official data for total final consumption in many sectors. So even though we know there might be some specific, excellent. So we got the report from Lee. So yeah, so we are very happy to receive, to exchange information. So this is the kind of exchange that we are looking for to try to improve our energy statistics for the different countries by this kind of peer exchange. So thank you very much. I don't see any other question, so maybe I will keep going with the presentation, and please keep sending us questions while the presentation is going on, and we will keep replying to them. So let's do again some Menti questions before we move on. Can you see Menti, Taylor? Yeah, okay, excellent. So again, it's the same code as before. So if you have disconnected, can you connect to www.menti.com and use the code that appears up on the screen now? So 13, 79, 73, and 13. So now we will be focusing on renewables and electricity. And so I'll just give you some time to connect to Menti website and use the code 13, 79, 73, and 13. And the first question is, what is the renewable energy source that witnessed the highest growth since 1990? So is it wind, solar photovoltaic, liquid biofuels, biogases, or geothermal? So please connect to www.menti.com and use the code 13797313. I don't see any answers. Let me try to refresh. Yeah, sorry, I had to refresh to see your answers. So we have 13 participants that replied, and 9 said that it's solar PV. Some is saying geothermal, some wind. So globally, what is the renewable energy source that witnessed the highest growth since 1990? Good. So let's look at the right answer. Most of you got it right. So since 1990, it's been solar PV that has witnessed the highest growth. And we'll look into more details in the renewables presentation. Next question. From an energy statistics point of view, what are the other uses of wood besides charcoal production? So from an energy statistics point of view, what are the other uses of wood besides charcoal production? Is it as a raw material for the production of furnitures, or as a combustible for cooking and space heating, or none of these? So think from a statistics point of view, that's the most important. What are the other usage of wood that you would report in the energy statistics apart from charcoal production? So we have already 10 participants that have replied, 11. And most of you are saying that from an energy statistics point of view, we should report it wood use as combustible for cooking and space heating. So let's look at the right answer. So the right, most of you got it right. So in energy statistics, we report only fuels used for energy purposes. So when you make a furniture, it's not an energy purpose. You're building a chair, a table. So this should not be reported in the energy statistics. So the wood that you're using for heating and cooking, this is an energy purpose, so that you should report. Next question. Which sector consumes the most electricity globally? So at the world level, do you think it's the residential sector, the industry sector? Is it commercial and services, or is it the transport sector? So which sector consumes the most electricity globally? So the majority of you think it's the industry sector. And let's look at the right answer. The right answer is indeed industry, and then it's followed by transport for globally. Now, let's think about Sub-Saharan Africa. In Sub-Saharan Africa, which sector consumes the most electricity? Do you think it's the same as world? or is it different? So we have 11 participants that replied. Most of you say that it is industry, like similar pattern as global level, but there's one who said residential and one who said transport. Do you think sub-Saharan Africa electricity consumption is the same pattern as that of global? Let's look at the right answer now. So most of you got it wrong. So here for sub-Saharan Africa, it's different. The sector that consumes the most electricity, it's the residential sector and not industry. So that was the last Menti question. And now let's move to the presentation again to hear more about renewables and electricity.
To renewables statistics. So now we will talk about renewables in our energy statistics. So when we talk about renewables, for example, here in the total energy supply, we can see that it represents global a little bit less than 40% of the total energy supply in the world. When we say renewables, this includes hydroelectricity and solar, wind, geothermal energy, and also biofuel and waste, which represent a large part of those renewables present within the total energy supply. If we look in more detail, we can see that almost 2/3 of renewables in our statistics are made of those biofuel and waste, and more specifically of solid biofuel and charcoal. Hydro represents the first element of electricity generations from renewable sources in our statistics. And it is present in a large part in the world electricity productions, which represent almost 15% of the electricity generated in the world. Renewable sources are the energy communities that have the largest and most important growth rates in the world. Between 1990 and 2018, solar PV gained 36.5% of in productions, followed by wind, biogas, solar thermal, and liquid biofuels, which led to the total renewables to grow of 2%, which is more than the global total energy supply growth in the same period. Now we will focus a little bit more on the biofuels part, which are, as we said before, important in Africa. So here is a reminder of the previous slide we showed before. So in sub-Saharan Africa, around 75% of total energy consumption is made of biofuel and mostly traditional biomass. This has implications on health, on social life, and also on the environment of those countries because of deforestation and maintenance of the area for the populations. And if we have a look, we can see that this on those primary on those biofuels, a large part, 93%, is made of primary solid biofuel, and a lesser part, around 7%, of charcoal. Now it's time for us to dive a little bit deeper on how we classify renewables, because for now we have talked about a lot of different products. Renewables and waste can be classified into 4 different groups. The first one will be the renewable electricity, renewable energy, which have primary energy form of only electricity. This includes, of course, hydro, wind, tide, wave, and ocean electricity generation, and solar photovoltaic or solar PV. So in here, the first point of measurement for the statistics is the electricity produced from those plants and structures. The second part will be the renewable energy, which can produce both heat and electricity, which have a primary energy form of heat. This is composed of geothermal and solar thermal. And in that case, the first point of measurement would be the heat created by the geothermal plant or the solar thermal panel. And then from this, we will see the electricity generated. The third part will be the combustible fuels, which can be stored or traded. So those are industrial waste, municipal waste, solid biofuel, biogases, and liquid biofuels. So they are treated such as, in the case of fossil fuel, let's say coal, for example, or oil products. So their quantities, their mass being used as a unit of measurement. And lastly, there is a non-combustible heat-only group which contain only heat pumps. This will not be covered in too much deeply in here because it's not that present on the African continent. So now let's see about solid biofuels to dive a little bit deeper on those important elements in Africa. We focus, as a reminder, for solid biofuel only on the fuel produced for energy purpose. So it is a small part of the total, for example, wood that will be cut in a year. We also do the distinctions between primary and secondary fuel following what is recommended in the IRS. So primary production is the capture or extraction of the fuel of an energy form from natural energy flows from the biospheres, and those only include the commerciable, marketable productions. The secondary production is the manufacture of energy production through the process of transformations of other fuel or energy, whether primary or secondary. So now that this distinction is made, let's see example of solid biofuels that we can encounter. So you would have bagasse, which are byproducts of the sugar industry, and same for other agronomic industries. You could have rice husk, olive cake, industrial wastes in a renewable form, for example, the natural rubbers. You have then wood pellets and animal waste, black liquor that is a byproducts of paper industries, and of course, wood and woody materials, so firewood, wood chips, sawdust, etc. And finally, one element in which we will dive a little bit deeper, charcoal, which is a product produced from wood products at the origin. So if we follow the biofuel transformation for charcoal productions, unlike the other transformation of combustible fuels, the transformation of wood to charcoal is covered by many international organizations to really dive and try to know more about it. The production of charcoal is an output of a transformation process where wood is considered the input. The losses from this are included in the transformation sectors and are checked by calculating the efficiency of the process. Hence, the importance to have some net calorific value for wood and for the charcoal produced so that we can have a clear view on the efficiency of these transformations. So, as before, we can see that wood is an input into the charcoal kiln. So here you have 2 examples of kiln that can be found in the world. And the output is the charcoal. So important facts about the charcoal production. The efficiency, of course, is the input divided by the output divided by the input. In energy units, we focus here on the energy content. So the reference NCV of charcoal that we use in our statistics is 30,800 kilojoule per kilograms. And the charcoal kiln efficiency that we usually expect is between 10 to 40%. Actually, in reality, we see efficiencies in our data set that goes from 20 to 70%. And this is an ongoing work to try to improve the data collection on those transformations so that we can have more sensible data in the end. Now we will see about the electricity statistics. So first of all, let's see some electricity trends. And what can be said about electricity demand and, of course, then production has grown a lot in the last 20 years, mostly due to the increased level of incomes from various regions such as Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. So the global production in 2018 was more than 26,000 terawatt hours, which is equivalent of 4.5 million wind turbines in the world. And Sub-Saharan Africa witnessed a threefold increase faster than the rest of the African continent. So we can see that electricity can be generated from various other sources, such as solar, hydro, nuclear, or fossil fuel, gas, oil, and coal. If we look at the share of each of those sources for electricity generation, we can see that depending on the region you are looking at, the origin of electricity will be really different. For example, in the case of OECD, it's more or less spread between coal, gas, and nuclear. And in Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, we see that hydro represents a large majority of the generations, followed closely by gas. Electricity generation mix is highly dependent on the most available and cheapest sources, as well as political choices and incentives in a determined country or regions. So if we look, for example, at the difference between the share of solar generations in OECD or in Sub-Saharan Africa, we can see here difference in terms of access to the technologies and political decisions made in various countries. Now, here are examples of those electricity mix in different countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. And obviously, it's really dependent on the political choices of one country and the availability within the border of the country. So now let's have a closer look at the electricity consumption by sectors to see where it is mostly consumed. In non-OECD countries in general, it's mostly consumed in industries. This is mostly due to the preeminence of China and India data within those countries. But in Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, we see that this share is mostly, this first place is mostly occupied by residential and in a lesser way by industries in terms of consumptions. So now let's have a look at residential electricity demand, since it was that important in the previous slide. So the increase in wealth drives higher consumption per capita, and then allows more people to have access to electricity in those countries. And this is a feedback loop. The more access led to an increase in wealth, etc., etc. So we can see in several countries between 2010 and 2019. For example, here we can see Ethiopia. But with the access growing for the population, we have an increase of the GDP within the country. So both elements are connected in our data sets. Now let's talk a little bit more about the data themselves. So how do we represent a tricky issue but that are electricity and heat data sets? In terms of supply, we collect the fuel inputs to electricity and heat generations, so the quantity of coal or natural gas burnt to generate electricity. From this, we obtain the gross productions, and we subtract to that the own use by the electricity plant to obtain the net production. In addition to those various elements, one can extract from the production the pumped storage hydro. In some specific hydro plants, the water are pumped back to play the role of stocks of possible energy sources, and some more detailed elements that are not that present on the African continent, which are electric boilers and heat pumps. Then we have the trade, so import and export of electricity. They are specific in the case of specific rules in case of electricity. We will see them a little bit later. And also an important part, which are the losses in transmission and distributions of this electricity. This precise element can be high in case of old or badly maintained transmission and distribution systems, but also due to theft of electricity. At the end of the chain, for the demand, we would have the final consumption of electricity for residential, industries, etc. In addition to all those elements that will be in either physical units for the fuel inputs or in gigawatt hours, one can collect also the peak load and the capacity of this electric system, which are very good indicators to be used later on the development of the country. So firstly, let's look at sources of electricity to see how we distinguish the possible sources. Electricity is produced as both primary and secondary energy commodity. Primary electricity is obtained from natural sources such as hydro, solar photovoltaic, wind, tidal, or wave energy, for example. Secondary sources are obtained from the heat generated by burning a combustible fuel. So either fossil fuel, coal, oil, gas, or etc., or also from nuclear fissions, from geothermal energy, and from solar thermal heat. So this is the first distinction that you can find in the dataset when we talk about primary electricity and secondary electricity. Now also some distinctions we can do in the electricity data are the type of producers. You can have main activity producers, which for whom the generations and of electricity or heat and the sale of this production to third party is their primary activity. So most of the time, those are plants like nuclear plants, thermal plants, natural gas, electricity plants, but for which the sole objective is to sell this electric or heat generated. And then we have the auto producers. Auto producers generate electricity and heat as a second or byproduct of their own activities. Let's say, for example, a windmill that will generate a little bit of electricity from its activity. It can sell this electricity to the grid without this being its main source of incomes. Now, another distinction in a type of plants would be the type of energy that is produced at the end of it. So you have electricity only, heat only, or combined heat and electricity, which is also referred as CHP, combined heat and power. Now that we have seen the distinctions we can do in the data, let's talk again about efficiencies. So if we insist on this in this presentation, it's because efficiencies are important to keep good track of your data sets and check the quality of your data set. And again, an efficiency is calculated by the output divided by the input in net using net calorific value for to work on energy units. And in energy units, it's always below 100%. The efficiency will differ by fuel or technologies. And once again, you must calculate your efficiency in energy unit every time you can. So, for example, an input of 100 units into a power plant would have an output of 20 units plus 45 units of 20 units of electricity plus 45 units of heat. And if you calculate the efficiency, considering it's all in the same unit, you have a 65% efficiency. The rest, the 45 units lost, are what we call the heat loss and are part of any transformations from one form of energy to another. So, just a reminder, use the same energy units everywhere. Hence the importance in energy balance, as you've seen in other presentations, of picking a correct energy unit. Now, let's go back a little bit when we were discussing about capacities. In addition to production, consumption, and trade data, we try also to capture in our data the power plant capacities, specifically the net maximum capacity. Net maximum capacity is simply the maximum power output that a power plant can produce with all plants running at full blast, and we consider for methodological reasons that we capture this on the 31st December of the reporting year. These are useful data for analysts to have. However, they can also be useful for statisticians when checking the data, as we can compare actual reported production value with the maximum potential production values to check if the data made sense. This value, actual production divided by potential production, is called the capacity factors. So, as you can see, capacity factor is actual production divided by capacity times the time of a year, in that case, or in any other time frame you are working here. Again, this value should always be less than 100%, except if there were plants closure near the end of the year, in which case the figure may be distorted. And there are different expected values depending on the technology. For instance, nuclear plants are expensive to build and therefore are typically run as much as possible, whereas solar PV, which does not run at night and is both weather and location dependent, will have lower capacity factors. So, as statistician, we can use both historical and expected capacity factor as a check in our data. Now, let's talk again on the concept between gross and net productions. Gross production refers to the total output of electricity or heat generated in a facility before any uses. However, not all of this is used for productive purpose beyond the power plants. Some of the electricity and heat generated is used on-site at the power plant for lighting, heating, and to support plant operations. This is referred to as on-use. The remainder that is left after subtracting the on-use is the net production. However, remember that for auto producers, productions only refer to the heat sold, heat or electricity sold to the grid, which bring to this kind of which brings us to a final check that you can do regarding the own use, but we expect it should not vary too much over time and stay around 5%. So as I told you in the previous slide, you have also a value expected, which is the transmission and distribution losses. So let's see a little bit more what's happening in the various part of those losses. As electricity travels through cables and transformers, energy is lost along the way. Much of this is in the form of heat, as the electric current flowing through the cable raises its temperature. This energy is lost as it dissipates into the surroundings, reducing the amount of energy that reaches the final destinations. In general, losses can be expected to be in the range about 5 to 15%. With losses on the lower end of the scale observed in more advanced, compact, and well-maintained grid, and higher losses observed in older or more distributed grid, and where there is a high rate of meter bypassing, in other words, theft of electricity. Now, let's see to finish on trade for electricity. As I told you, there are specific rules regarding trade of electricity. Unlike other fuels, trade of electricity and heat are more difficult to understand because they are not physical units that you can move by yourself. It's a flow of electrons through a cable. So how do you report this? Well, you report it as a flow, actually, like a flow through, going through borders of a country. And in that case, we do not focus on the origin and destinations of those electrons. Let's take an example to see it a little bit more clearly. Here we have 3 countries, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria. So let's imagine that Togo is importing electricity from Nigeria through the network of Benin. Those 3 countries would have to report the flows as it follows. Nigeria would report exportations toward Benin. Benin would report some importations from Nigeria and the same value exported towards Togo. And Togo would report the importation from Benin. So here, for electricity, this is the only part where in our methodology we report the transit of flows. Now we will briefly discuss on the possible electricity data sources for your data collections. So very briefly, we already discussed about this before. You can use surveys toward power producers, toward enterprise, households, or market or operators to collect from them on a regular basis data on value of production or consumptions. You can use administrative data from energy regulators, customs office for the trades, and data collecting from program policy implementations to check the efficiency of specific policies. You can use direct measurements, so using conventional or smart meters to directly measure on a building or on a specific place the consumption on regular points. And finally, you can use estimation and modeling, for example, using the plant capacity informations to estimate generations of specific sources. With this, we reach the end of these presentations. So the IEA have a lot of resources available online. So some free products, such as the keyword energy statistics, data and statistics browser, and energy atlas manuals on energy statistics methodologies. And we have also a lot of various energy data on specific flows, on CO2 emissions, and or energy price.
So If you have any questions now on the renewables and electricity, don't hesitate to send it to us. In the meantime, we already received quite a few during the presentation in the Q&A box. So there was one from Ezekiel about industrial waste heat. How do we report this? Taylor, would you like to reply to this one?
Sure. So any combustible fuel can be used in combined heat and power plants. So the nature of the plant is independent from the fuel. So we consider a plant to be combined heat and power if it produces both usable heat that is used for productive purposes and electricity. So any combustible fuel can be used to power this plant. So regarding your question about industrial waste heat, so yes, if industrial waste is used in a combined heat and power plant, that would be the case. But if you're only producing heat, heat that is used for productive purposes from industrial waste, and that would be considered a heat-only plant. So I hope that is clear. And another point to mention about industrial waste is that there's both renewable and non-renewable components. So it is important to make sure that you're reporting both and that the split between them is realistic. So we often see a 50% split between renewable and non-renewable industrial waste.
Thanks a lot, Taylor. And we have two more questions from Lee Okumbe. In the classification of renewables, where do you place gasification of biomass to synthetic gas, which is then used in the electricity generation?
So production of syngas from biomass, that would be considered biogas. So you can report the amount of syngas produced under biogas production, and then can proceed as normal, reporting that under biogas used in electricity plants.
Thank you. There's another one on losses. In the electricity balance, do you consider both technical and commercial losses as reported by the utilities, or do you use benchmarks considering there may be an element of bias in the data provided?
So we generally use the losses as they are reported by the utilities. And generally, we find that they are, I would say, within reason. In terms of bias, as in not reporting losses, we can sometimes see that this may be the case if losses are particularly low for the region, or statistical differences are high because their losses are not being reported. But generally, we find that we don't need to account for bias in our statistics. We just use the utilities data.
Yeah, exactly. And when we find that values are too high, we usually question the countries, and if there's a good explanation, we keep it. I remember, I think it was for Venezuela, where we had like over 50% of losses. And that was because of theft in the country, and it was very common there. So we have special cases where we report very high losses. There's another question. Kindly elaborate from your experience why in Sub-Saharan Africa households account for the highest consumption of electricity, as opposed to the global scenario where industry is the largest consumer. So yeah, in the it was in the Menti question where we showed that at the world level, industries were consuming the highest share of electricity consumption, but in sub-Saharan Africa, it was residential consumption. So this is what we found from our data that we have from countries, and very often this is based on the data that we receive, but it doesn't. There's a real lack of data for total final consumption sectors in Africa in general, and this is because of lack of surveys. And often for industry, we don't have enough information and it's reported as zero. So this is something that we noticed. For example, even this week we were discussing with a country, with the Djibouti, where industry it's zero. Industry consumption it's zero, and there's some residential consumption reported. This is because you have household surveys, but not necessarily surveys for the industry sector. So we are not capturing that information. So whatever we showed you, this is based on the information that we have currently, but there are ways to improve it. And yeah, I don't know if Taylor, you would like to add something on this?
No, nothing from me.
Thank you. So I think that's it. There was a participant who raised her hand. Let me check again. I thought Elizabeth Akinye, would you like to? I see a raised hand. Do you have a question? No question?
Sorry, I think I tapped that by mistake.
No problem. Thanks. So if we don't have any new question, then we'll move with the last part of this session, which is we have a question from Dr. Francis. Let me take this question before.
Yeah, actually, it's not a question. It's maybe to just kind of think a little bit along the lines of between residential and industries. One thing that would happen, like in the case of Kenya, there is a certain transition that is happening. Normally, the main electricity company has been selling electricity to the industry and to the residential. So the first thing is that the industries are not so many.
Yeah.
That is one thing. You see, when you compare industries, you compare that with the industries in Western world. The industries in the Western world are many compared with the residential, so to speak.
Yeah.
Then the second thing is also the geographical spread of how the households are. Like if you look at Kenya, the main grid is just a straight line coming from the western part of Kenya, no, the eastern part of Kenya, the coast, going all the way to the western part, Lake Victoria there. It's a straight line. So majority of the industries are located there, and majority of the residential houses connected are located there. Then, so you find that for that, you'll find that the industries being few, you'll find you don't have so much industry work. Then the third thing, which is now what is happening now, a number of industries are actually starting to switch to their own generation.
Yeah.
In terms of like putting their own panels, putting maybe their own cogeneration and all this. And this means in a sense, they are no longer taking a lot of the grid electricity. So that might, I don't know if that brings bias or it brings skewness on the data. I'm not so sure, but it does create a special need that maybe IEA could like maybe commission maybe a small mini survey, just maybe 5-10 questions, and we ask around the industries and we see what are their sources of energy, how much, when did they switch off from maybe the grid, or how much they are consuming vis-a-vis how much they are actually generating themselves. Something like this, which could bring a kind of an understanding as to the situation actually in some of the sub-Saharan African countries. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Francis. And this makes me remember that when we did the previous Africa Energy Outlook, this is one of the challenges that we had to face, was that mini grids were not well reported or not reported at all in some countries. And in the energy balance, usually that's information just based on main grids and from power plants, and a lot of consumption in Africa is happening through mini grids, especially for industries, and this is completely not reported at all for many countries. So that's a very good point that you mentioned here, that often the energy balances is lacking a part of the picture from those mini grids in countries. So that's, I think we don't have any more questions. So let me share the exercise. So I don't know if many of you got the time to check on the Google Drive for the exercise and practiced it. But anyway, I will quickly do the correction now. So we'll look at it together, and if you want to redo it again after, just to be sure that you understand everything, you can do and send it to me by email, and I can correct it for you. So that exercise was it's a simple one. So you have data for I hope that you're seeing well my screen and it's not too small. Let me know if you want me to zoom it a bit more. So you have data for natural gas in cubic meters, in million cubic meters. So it's the table in blue. And here we are asked to study the efficiency of electricity generation in country A from natural gas as a new plant project is being discussed. So from the Ministry of Energy, you receive this statistics sheet for natural gas. And so here in the table, you can see production, imports, exports, stock change, and total energy supply for natural gas. Then you have some statistical differences, and you have some demand for gas for electricity plants to produce electricity, and also some final consumption for industry, residential, and other sectors, such as commercial, agriculture, or other sectors. So then you have your total demand, and the difference between your supply and your demand is what goes into your statistical difference. So then you have a first question here. Using the gross calorific values for natural gas production and imports, calculate the weighted average gross calorific value for production and imports from 2013 to 2019. So these are the highlighted cells that we need to calculate. So here, in the green table, you have your calorific values, gross calorific values for production. So you see that from 2010 to 12, there's no values reported. And that's also because up here, you can see that there was no production. So if there's no production, you don't need a calorific value. And then you have some calorific values reported here up to 2019 for production. Then for imports, you have some calorific values as well. So usually when you're collecting data for imports, you're also collecting the calorific value, the relative calorific value from the countries that is from which you're importing natural gas. So then you have to calculate your weighted average calorific value. So for 2010 to 2012, given that there's no production, you don't need to do a weighted average, it's just equal to imports. But then for 2013, we discussed this many times in the presentation, how to do the calculation for weighted average. So it's very easy. You take your amount of production, you multiply it by your calorific value for production. So 9 times 38 plus, you need to do for imports as well. So plus 150 times your calorific value for imports. Then you divide it by the sum of your production and import quantities. And that would give you your weighted calorific value. So in Excel, you can use the formula sum product. it's the same as I just described to you. So the same formula, you apply it till 2019 and you will get your calorific values. So here, what do we observe from the calorific values? So for 2013, it's very close to the imports values. And why? And this is because you have very little production compared to imports. So it's normal that your weighted average would be closer to the imports. But if you look at 2019, the amounts are more or less the same. So your calorific value, it's in between your calorific value for production and imports. So, which is good as it's weighted. So then there's the second question. Can you identify something wrong with the production gross calorific values, and what are the options to correct this? So here, what we see is that from 2013 to 2019, it's the same calorific values, 38 megajoules per cubic meters. And this is suspicious because, as we said, calorific values, it varies over time. And so it cannot be the same for 10 years. So how can we, this is the result that you report the same values because sometimes you don't collect this information. So you're using default values. And how can we fix this is that whenever we are collecting production quantities, we need to ask in our surveys from the producer companies to also report the calorific values. And we can ask them to provide us with more information on this through by having a new survey or by having a questionnaire, or we can also have a mandate with the countries to submit it to us. Sometimes we know that if it's not mandatory, then companies don't think it's important to report these calorific values. So making it compulsory to report it at the same time as the data, as the quantities, then it makes it easier for statistical officers and ministries to get that information. So here, a very quick reminder for natural gas calorific value, it's expected to be within a certain range, so between 37.5 and 40.5 megajoule per cubic meter. So the range is good, but we need to have updated calorific values every year. So that was question 1. And the question 2 is, using those calorific values up in green, calculate the natural gas balance in terajoules, so in energy units gross calorific values. So in blue here, you have your energy your energy statistics for natural gas, but we want it in terajoules. And up here you have it in cubic meters, so in physical units. So how do we do this? So for production, it's just you take your amount in physical units in cubic meters times your calorific value. So for example, for 2013, you take 9 times 38, and that would give you your amount in terajoule. For imports as well, so you take your imports, you multiply by your calorific value for imports. But for the others, so for exports, for electricity plants, industries, you don't have a specific calorific value. So for those, you will use your weighted calorific values to your average weighted calorific value to get your data in terajoule. So it's very simple. Everywhere you will apply the weighted calorific value. So that was it for question 2. Question 3, using the calculated balance, so this new natural gas balance in terajoule, calculate a verifying indicator for statistical difference. So here we are asked to calculate a check for statistical difference. And usually what we do, even at the IEA, we have those checks within our energy balances, is that we calculate the share of statistical difference from total supply. So you will calculate how much is your statistical difference over your total supply. And for 2010, it's 2%, and 2019, it's 4%. But here you will see that when you observe, so that's the question 4, observing the statistical difference verification indicator, do you see any year for which the data is suggesting that we have a problem? So yes, we see a big problem here, because in 2015, the statistical difference is very high. So it's minus 3,768 terajoule, and it represents 55% of your total energy supply, which is very, very suspicious. And this means that either a flow in your supply or in your demand is wrongly reported. So we need to query this, this issue here. So already here we see there's a problem in the natural gas balance. Let's go to the next question, where we will dig more into the consequences of those. So using the natural gas and electricity generation data, so here now you have for the same country your electricity generation from the different fuels. So how much electricity is produced from coal, from natural gas, you have your total generation and everything. So now it says the question 5 is using the gas and electricity data as well as the conversion factors. So here we have conversion factors of how to convert from gigawatt to terajoule and vice versa. Calculate the electricity generation efficiency for natural gas. So here we need to calculate the efficiency for natural gas. So how do we calculate this? For efficiency, it's calculated as output divided by input, but it needs to be in the same energy unit, right? So here you will take for 2010, you will take for natural gas, you will take your electricity output divided, which is in your electricity output, it's in gigawatt. You divide it by your input, sorry, here, in energy unit, not in physical unit. So how much of your natural gas goes to electricity plants? So you divide it by 3,420, but this is in terajoule, and you want everything in the same unit. So then you divide it by 3.6 to have everything in gigawatt. And so you calculate both same unit, and you get 30%. And so if you apply the same formula everywhere, output divided by input in the same unit, you get those efficiencies. And here again, 2015 has an issue. You have a very low calorific value. So here, question 6, do you notice issues with any of the calculated efficiencies? So yes, because it has been the range between 30 and 35, but in 2015, you get 20%, which is very low. Again, you can see that it's arising from your natural gas statistical difference, which was high. So suspiciously low. So what can be wrong here? It can be the output that is wrongly reported or the input. So if we look now at the output, we can see that it's okay. It's within for 2015. I don't see anything suspicious. The trend looks fine. But if you go up and you look at your inputs, you see that in 2015, it increases quite a lot compared to 2015 and then decreases again in 2016. Whereas your electricity output, even though here you see a decline in 2015, but you see an increase in input. So you're putting more gas in your power plant, but you're having less output, which is suspicious. So the question, exactly, so this is what I just described. So most probably it's the input that is wrong. And we have seen that the gas supply and demand balance is not balanced because of this huge statistical difference. So now we are asked, try to correct the wrong reported figure in the statistics. So how can we fix this by ourselves? Because first you need to go to your data providers and ask them. But if you can't, if they don't send you the corrections, you cannot publish those information. You know it's wrong. So we can try to fix it ourselves. So here, let's start with the efficiency. We know that this 20% efficiency, it's wrong. And we can try to use an average efficiency. So by looking at the year before and the year after, you see that before and after it's 35%. So we can apply the same efficiency for 2015 to get a reasonable input of natural gas to your power plant. So we'll use this and we will go, so we will go up here. And what we will do is that we will take the amount of output. So you will take this and then you will back calculate it using 35% efficiency. And then you will use your, I think I got it right now. Yeah. So what I did was I took my output, which I think it's correct, and I will back calculate my input using this 35% efficiency. But my output was in gigawatt hour, and I want my input in terajoule, so I also need to convert to terajoule. That's why I also use the conversion factor from terajoule to gigawatt. So that gives me a more reasonable, instead of 8,000 something, I got now 4,958 terajoule as input to my electricity plants. And if you look at your statistical difference check now, it goes back to a normal range, -2%. And your calorific value, your efficiency, we fix it to 35%. So that's it. So this was an exercise that I hope make you understand a bit better some of the concepts that we explain through the presentation, and it make you realize understand a bit more how calorific values are used, the conversion from physical units to energy units, efficiencies, statistical difference check that you can apply in your different balances, and a bit how you need to check and fix those small things. I think in all data sets you have sometimes these kind of issues that you need to fix by ourselves when data providers don't make the revisions themselves. So these are the kind of things that you can fix and then submit to your data provider for validation. Often at the IEA, that's what we do as well. Sometimes we notice errors in data that countries send to us, and then we propose to them solutions to make the data more consistent within the fuels and inside the energy balance. I don't know if you have any question on this. And again, I think the best way is to take some time, take 15 minutes, go through again the exercise by yourself and the solution. And if you have any further question, write to me. I'm very happy to go through it again with you if you have any question. Let me check if we have anything. I don't see any questions, so no questions. And I see that we have also reached the end of our session. It's 11. It's 11 here in Paris, but later in Nairobi. So I hope you enjoyed this webinar, and we managed to teach you. You learned something from us on the different commodity statistics. And next Tuesday, we will now go even further and look at energy balances. So how do we move from the different commodity statistics and commodity balances and create energy balance? Then we will see how do we use energy balances data to calculate CO2 emissions, which is very important indicator. So thank you very much for your attention today, and thanks a lot, Taylor, for helping me with the questions. I wish you all a very good afternoon, and see you again next Tuesday. I see a question. It was just thank you. Thanks a lot, Sebastian. And yeah, so next Tuesday it will be me again and Taylor as well. Thank you. Bye, everyone.